Well, the conventions are wrapped and we are off to the races, even more so because the commercials make it clear the political season is well underway. And while Trump and Clinton will get a lot of the airtime, the local elections may have a bigger impact on our daily lives. We're just about close enough to the August 2nd Missouri primary to start counting down in hours instead of days. So tonight we are breaking down the ballot, as far down the ballot as we can squeeze in. Joining us in studio, journalist and poli-sci professors Joe Mannies from St. Louis Public Radio and Tony Messenger from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Dave Robertson from the University of Missouri St. Louis, and Andy Theising from Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. The polls are about to open. Do you know enough to know who you'll vote for? Stay tuned. Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 network of public media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned. The Missouri primary will be held on the heels of the Republican and Democratic national conventions. But come August 2nd, Missourians won't be voting for Trump or Clinton. The Missouri primary features statewide offices to see which candidates will square off in the general election in November. Much has been said about the race for the Republican nomination for governor, but there are many other races that could be just as important. As we prepare for the home stretch of the political season, where do Missouri and Illinois sit in the national political conversation, and why are these local primaries so important here at home? Statewide races and some local races, a lot to talk about. We're going to try to go fast because we've got a lot to squeeze in, from the governor's race to the attorney general's race to U.S. House of Representatives on down to circuit attorney in the city. We'll start with, though, some information, some feedback we got on Twitter this week. We said, which local races are you watching the most? Not surprisingly, I guess, at least if you're judging by what we're seeing on TV, Missouri governor, that's the race that a lot of people are talking about. So let's talk about that, especially on the Republican side, particularly on the Republican side. We've got 4 candidates: John Brunner, multimillionaire businessman; Eric Greitens, the former Navy SEAL; Catherine Hanaway, the former U.S. attorney and former House Speaker here in Missouri; and then Peter Kinder, the longtime lieutenant governor. All pretty neck and neck, judging by some polls we've seen recently, and pretty similar too, it seems like. From Dave, you and I watched a debate last night. They didn't really sound that much different on that many issues. What do you expect between now and August 2nd from these candidates?
I expect a lot of things that are very negative on the air, but also a lot of mailers that come into boxes, people's mailboxes, some door-to-door stuff, some telephones. There's a lot of money in this race to use a lot of technology to get a little bit of an advantage in this race, and a little advantage goes a long way in a 4-way race.
Are they distinguishing themselves from each other at all?
Yeah, well, see, philosophically, they're all pretty close. So since they don't have many differences on the issues, it's all about personality and character. So that's why you're seeing all this stuff basically saying, my opponent is a crook. Do not elect him or her. And my opponent has done this or that. Do not elect him or her. And it's, if you notice, nobody's talking about, in their ads, they're not talking about right to work or the state's economy, or even the social issues, or a little bit about guns, but just so you know, we're for guns, and there's all 4 of them. But that is one of the things that has happened with this race. They've spent a ton of money, $10 million just this month. Which is close, I think, to the record. I don't think it's the record. If you take inflation into account, 1992 is still the worst.
Well, let's talk about that.
But it's crazy.
Because Tony, well, you say crazy. Tony, you said it was obscene in a recent article.
I can't even think of a strong enough word to describe what we're starting to see in Missouri in terms of the amount of money that is spent in races. The governor's race, the attorney general's race, there's been more than $10 million raised already in that race, and that's unheard of in terms of a lower ticket statewide race.
Where's it coming from?
It's coming from, in John Brunner's case, it's his own pocket. In Eric Greitens' case, it's millionaires and billionaires from all over the country. In Peter Kinder's case, it's one billionaire from Southwest Missouri, and in Catherine Hanaway's case, it's one billionaire from right here in St. Louis. And so it's a bunch of wealthy people taking advantage of the fact that Missouri is one of the few states in the country that has no campaign limits whatsoever. And then you add Citizens United that allows somewhat anonymous and unlimited money going to certain types of political action committees nationally. That's how Eric Greitens was able to take in the largest individual donation to a individual candidate for office in Missouri history, $1.9 million from a political action committee in which we won't know who that money actually comes from, if ever, not until after the election.
Yeah, the money has been declared to be free speech, but nobody knows who's talking at this point in the case of these organizations. We can tell a lot more from the people who are putting lots of money into Hanaway's campaign, for example, or we can tell that Bruner is putting money into his campaign. But I think what's really troubling is that there are so many contributors whose names we just don't know. We don't know where the money is coming from.
So why does that matter? Not to ask a dumb question, but why does this bother you guys?
Well, I think there's information out there that voters need to have, because if someone is a front to a different kind of interest that perhaps no one knows about, I think people might base their vote on that. And because of the way we do our filings, and we don't ask for a lot of information and we give people lots of time to compile it, you can play these sort of shell games where you can kind of hide money and hide donors until the very last minute.
So it's the anonymity that bothers you more than the money?
Well, the money bothers me too.
They both bother me, but the anonymity is what makes it worse. And here's an example. So Eric Greitens got the largest check that we're talking about, $1.9 million, and it's the largest one that's anonymous. We don't know where that money came from. If you follow the political discussions on Twitter and Facebook, for instance, from Republican operatives, there is a movement right now to really make sure that Republican voters know before Tuesday that Eric Greitens spent a bunch of time in the White House, used to be a Democrat, and used to like Barack Obama. In Eric Greitens' most recent ad, he calls Barack Obama the worst president the country's ever seen. And so knowing where that money comes from when you have an unknown candidate who's trying to define himself for the first time in front of the electorate helps voters be able to determine, is this guy telling me the truth? Who's really supporting him? What might I expect if he's actually the next governor?
And it's not just the governor's race.
No, and this is something that some experts and others had been expecting the last couple of years, but this year is the first time you're really seeing it in such huge amounts from these anonymous groups. I mean, basically, they've organized under certain parts of the IRS code that allows them never to identify their donors or to identify them like months from now. I mean, without boring with the details. But the bottom line is, you know, there's all sorts of rumors about Greitens' money. Is it him? Is it somebody else? And in the same way, there have been these anti-Bruner ads that were running for weeks. No one will probably ever know who was behind those ads. That group spent millions. Nobody's going to know who it is. And in the case of the Attorney General's race, you've got a whole bunch of several groups that are targeting one of the candidates.
Before we move, I want to go to
Right.
Attorney, but just real quick, do we have any favorites? Who do you think pulls it out on the Republican side for governor? Is it too close to call?
Well, and I want to emphasize, polls and primaries are notoriously inaccurate.
Okay. Because
primaries often have such low turnout. It depends on who turns out, and there's no ballot issues. This is the first time since '98 there hasn't been a major ballot issue.
Although I think I heard today the
primary.
Secretary of State is expecting higher than 2012 on Tuesday at 30%.
I don't buy it, but I know that, but I don't buy it.
Okay.
But my point is that you've got nothing else to bring people to the polls, so you may just have diehards, and they're predicting lower than expected, lower turnout in St. Louis County. They're only predicting like 25%. If it's 31% statewide, that means a bunch of the rural counties that are mainly Republican are going to be turning out in big numbers if that happens. So I think that I just remember the 2012 polls that had Bruner with a comfortable lead in the U.S. Senate race. going into the election day, and we all know how that turned out.
Okay, all right. Well, I won't make you pick one anyway right now. Okay, Attorney General. Going on to Attorney General. On the Democratic side, Teresa Hensley and Jake Zimmerman, and then on the Republican side, Josh Hawley and Kurt Schaefer. And I have a feeling that's the side where we're talking about all the money. Correct?
Right.
Correct.
Absolutely.
And why so much money on this particular race? Dave, you and I kind of talked about this the other day on Channel 5. My gosh, you're saying more in the Attorney General race than the governor's race. Why is this such an important race?
Attorney General is a critical position. Not only is it a launching pad for higher office, but attorneys general around the country have used that office to pursue an agenda that makes them often national characters. So that some of the Republican attorneys general, as in Oklahoma, now Texas, are using that office to make all kinds of filings against Obama administration regulations, against Obamacare, and they get a lot of positive publicity from that and campaign contributions. And some of that has happened on the Democratic side too.
Sticking with the Republicans for just a second, what have we learned about these two candidates? What do we know? How are they separating themselves?
Well, again, it's fairly similar. I mean, basically, this is a mano-a-mano thing with one billionaire backing one, David Humphreys. He's putting a lot of money in Hawley. And then you've got Rex Sinquefield who's putting a lot of money behind Schaefer. On many of the key issues, they're the same. I mean, Schaefer is emphasizing that he had practiced in courtrooms and that Hawley has been more of a constitutional lawyer where he writes briefs. Hawley emphasizes that he used to be a clerk for John Roberts on the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's all, again, it's all about the personal. It's not about the
I was going to
issues.
say, it seems like they emphasized what they see as negatives for the other person. I feel like more negative ads than any self-describing ads.
Right, and I think especially in the last few days, you're going to see more of that because they've got this money. They feel like they need to spend it. And then in Schaefer's case, there's all this independent money. Again, we don't know where it's coming from. Hawley swears it's not him, that are running all these ads that are targeting a vote that Schaefer took several years ago in the state legislature, which allowed foreign companies to own some agricultural land in Missouri. Missouri used to have an outright ban, but after Smithfield Farms was purchased by the Chinese, they changed the laws so a certain percentage, small, can be purchased by foreign companies. A lot of the legislators, Republican and Democrat, voted for that. Jay Nixon, who's a Democrat, signed it. But Schaefer is taking the heat for it right now.
I think one of the reasons that there's so much money in this race has to do with Kurt Schaefer himself. Schaefer is from Columbia and used to be, as Hawley points out in one of the ads, a moderate. He used to brag about it. I knew Kurt when I was still covering the Capitol when I lived in Columbia as well. And he's a guy that in order to win his Senate seat had to be the moderate that he used to be, and that a lot of people think that he is. And I'm not using that in a pejorative as his opponent is. But Senator Schaefer has spent much of his political career in the last few years inventing this right-wing, angry conservative who loves guns more than anybody else, and he did that in order to try to keep everybody out of his primary. And he was successful in getting Eric Schmidt to go into another race and Tim Jones not to run against him. But then this Josh Hawley guy comes out of nowhere and convinces a lot of people, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, the Republicans will decide for themselves on Tuesday, that this guy isn't who he's pretending to be. And so you have all of this money going into this race, trying to define a guy, Josh Hawley, who nobody knows, and redefine a guy who appears to be trying to be somebody that he wasn't historically. And so voters are getting all of this personal stuff when on the issues that they vote on, they're probably very similar.
Let's don't neglect the Democratic side. All of this money coming in, is it a Republican foregone conclusion that they'll continue on and win in November, or does Jake Zimmerman or Teresa Hensley, can they hold their own, whichever one comes out of there on Tuesday?
Well, you can guarantee that the National Association of Attorneys General, I probably mangled the name, but there is that, and that they will probably be pouring some money in to help the Democrat, just as the Republican counterpart will be putting some in to help the Republican. It's not a foregone conclusion. Hensley, who's the former Cass County prosecutor, she is Senator Claire McCaskill sort of denies it, but actually a lot of the Democratic establishment wanted Hensley. Zimmerman, who's the St. Louis County assessor and who's a lawyer, they wanted him to run for Secretary of State, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to run for Attorney General. Well, he's raised a lot more money than Hensley, and it's going to be interesting if he wins on Tuesday, whether or not the Democratic Party in the state gets behind him then when they didn't before, because he is a strong money raiser. But I'm sure the Democrats are freaking out when they're seeing all this money pouring in on the Republican side. These giant donations that we're seeing so far are mainly going to Republicans. It doesn't mean the Democrats won't get them in the general, but right now most of it's pouring in to the GOP.
Okay, back to the slide that we saw just a minute ago, the U.S. House of Representatives, District 1. Lacey Clay, longtime congressman for District 1, a challenger in Maria Chappelle-Nadal, and Bill Haas, who has run for office several times, as we know. But is this a significant challenge?
I don't think it's I think that Clay has to be careful, but I think he has such a strong organization, such loyalty in District 1. I think that he goes in with an advantage. There's been a Clay on the ballot for 50 years. And I think people love that family. In fact, I was just thinking, Missourians love to elect people in families, and we have Clays on the ballot, we have Ashcrofts on the ballot, we have Carnahans on the ballot, and Blunts on the ballot, and so we have all of these families, and I think that there is that family edge, and so I think Clay has the edge.
It would be an upset if either of those challengers to Clay were able to beat him, and Clay pretty soundly defeated Carnahan when the two ran against each other for the nomination a few years ago.
Let's real quick though. Let's check in your colleague Jason Rosenbaum. We're going to come back to you in just a second because you were at the RNC. Right. Jason though is at the DNC. We checked in with him a little bit earlier. Here's Jason's Missouri report from the Democratic National Convention.
So my first takeaway from the Democratic National Convention is there are a lot of people covering the Democratic National Convention from the media. My second takeaway is that there aren't that many people covering the Missouri delegation. Me and the Kansas City Star were often the only media people in the room when we had these breakfasts. And by comparison, Illinois, which is a much larger state, often had 15, 20, 25 people surrounding them at certain points. So I don't know whether that means that Missouri is just not as critical in the presidential race as others, or it may just be that maybe people don't see covering these conventions as worthwhile anymore because the outcome really isn't in doubt. The third takeaway that I've had is that the Missouri delegation, which was split evenly between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, I think got along really well. I think many of the Bernie Sanders delegates from Missouri are a very pragmatic sort. They are obviously disappointed in the result, some more so than others. But I think that many of them are harnessing their energy to work for state and local candidates throughout Missouri. And they really feel like the movement that Bernie Sanders started was more than just about a man and more than just about one candidate. It's about his ideas.
Joe, what was the coverage like for Missouri at the Republican National Convention?
Well, it was the same way. I mean, unfortunately, in Missouri, most of the news outlets didn't send anybody. So it was just me, somebody from the Star, and then there was a reporter from Gannett who was covering Missouri and a couple other states. So she was floating in and out.
Is that a commentary on the state of journalism, or does that just mean we're not that relevant?
Well, I think it's more of a commentary on the state of journalism. Although, as far as Missouri being relevant, Missouri hasn't gone for a Democratic candidate for president since 1996. That was Bill Clinton. It was close in 2000, and close in 2008, but still, it's gone with a Republican ever since. The Democrats have figured out how to win the White House without us. So they don't need Missouri anymore to win the White House. The Republicans figure, well, if the Democrats aren't campaigning there and we're going to get them, why should we waste money here? So there's a lot of thought, in fact, in Cleveland, at our breakfast, because the breakfasts are where all the big name comes in and talk and all that. The general consensus was that Missouri may not see that much of either presidential candidate because, for the reasons I just said. which means that right now some of the polls, however good they are or not, show Trump with a lead. If Trump has a large lead in Missouri, there is a feeling that could have a trickle-down effect and help the Republicans further down the ticket. So there is some pressure to either get Hillary or surrogates or whatever to do some campaigning here so that at the top it's close enough that it doesn't trickle down and affect the other statewide candidates on the ballot.
I think I go back to your, you asked about the Attorney General race and what happens with, the Democrat against whoever the Republican ends up being. And I think all of those Democrats in particular, from Attorney General on down, are hoping that Hillary Clinton decides to make Missouri competitive. One of the reasons that Missouri in the last few years or the last few cycles hasn't been particularly competitive. We lost an electoral seat because of our population. And then our two big population bases are on the border. And so when you spend TV money, all those TV ads you're seeing, when you spend TV money in St. Louis and Kansas City, much of it is wasted in that you're getting Illinois viewers or you're getting Kansas viewers. And those
where
who
the
watch
outcomes are more solidified.
Right. Well, and when you're watching TV in St. Louis, for instance, you'll often see political ads for Illinois people, and you're like, why am I seeing that? Well, it's because of the way our TV markets work. And so, when you're pinching pennies at that national level, when the race is getting close at the end, you look at Missouri and say, it's not an efficient use of my TV money.
Let's do a speed round here because we're about out of time. St. Louis County Council, as we make our way down the ballot, a lot of talk after Ferguson that the council didn't represent the way the county looks, the concerns of the county, anything. There are 3 seats up for election. Anything significant change-wise going on at the county council level that you guys are aware of?
Well, it'll be a Democrat likely to win the seat in the northern part of the county. But the question is going to be whether it's an African American or a white Democrat, one that represents labor or one that's a newcomer to this area. And that's going to be a really interesting seat to watch.
There are some established political organizations up there in North County. It'd be very
Right.
hard for a newcomer to penetrate that because, again, there's a lot of loyalty and there's a lot of channels for money.
But the African American population is growing pretty rapidly in that part of the county and could offset that a bit.
Okay, the St. Louis City Circuit Attorney. We got 4 candidates, one of whom has been endorsed by the outgoing Circuit Attorney. I guess broadly, is this an issue that people beyond the city of St. Louis should even care about? Is this strictly a city issue, or does this have some sort of ramifications beyond regionally?
Well, the St. Louis Circuit Attorney has a lot of impact, part of its image, because they handle so many cases, things that happen in the city, and it happens to people whether they live in the city or not. Now, the Circuit Attorney's race also is one that could be affected by all the stuff we've been talking about. This is a Democratic fight. Well, a lot of Republicans who live in the city often take Democratic ballots in the primary so they can weigh in on the city offices. Well, because this one is on the ballot at the same time you've got the governor's race and the AG's race and other things, the perception is many city Republicans are going to go ahead and take Republican ballots, which means they won't have a voice on Circuit Attorney or any of the other big city races, and actually that could have a dramatic effect on who wins. And the primary for Circuit Attorney is basically
the election.
That's the election.
Okay, last question here. I think we have time to squeeze in. Again, back to Ferguson and some young people that are on the scene. Rasheen Aldridge, the youngest member of the Ferguson Council, he's running for Ward 5 committeeman. Let's see, another Bruce Franks running for state representative, District 8. Do you see any momentum for newcomers on the scene here in the region?
I think that's going to be something that the political scientists will get into studying after the election. You look at DeRay Mckesson, who was one of the big protesters that became a national name during Ferguson, who ran for mayor in Baltimore and didn't do very well at all. And you could say, well, he didn't do very well at all, so there's nothing to that movement. Well, look at the number of people that are following that example and running in local races. And so I think this November, the question isn't whether or not some of the African Americans that are getting more active because of the Black Lives Matter movement win. The question is, do they become active? Do they start to build coalitions? Do the numbers of voter turnout in those certain districts and areas show that there is some excitement and momentum? That's going to be the question, and I don't think we'll know that until after the primary and after November to be able to answer that question. I don't think it's a simple yes or no whether or not some of those candidates win or lose. Some of them may just be the wrong candidate at the wrong time in the wrong area, but that doesn't mean that they aren't participating in something that's going to show some momentum that could change the region in terms of how we view electoral politics.
Just as important is to find out what people are thinking in Ferguson, and we'll have people doing polls in the election to try to figure out what it is that's on the mind of the voters in that city.
And then we'll have more from Illinois after this primary season. We've got some interesting, especially a U.S. Senate race that could get interesting in November as well. Andy Theising, Dave Robertson, Tony Messenger, and Joe Mannies, thank you all for being here. Well, I'll give you one last question. Biggest issue, any surprises? What's the biggest issue you're looking for on Tuesday?
Governor's race.
Governor's race, says Tony.
Agreed.
Same.
Any upsets? Joe, you got to give us one. Go. You can't say governor's race.
Well, I'll be curious actually further down on the Republican ballot, because you've got some really tight ones that no one's paying attention to, like Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of State, and I'll be curious to see who comes out of that.
Secretary of State matters. It deals with elections in the state. Lots of national people are looking at who's going to be the Secretary of State in lots of places.
Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Make it to the
Yeah,
polls.
thank you.
Make it to the polls on Tuesday, everybody.